Imagine being the king of American beer. Your slogan, "The beer that made Milwaukee famous," is known across the nation. You've been number one for decades, surviving prohibition when rivals went bankrupt, bouncing back as the world's largest brewer. By the 1950s, you're battling Budweiser for supremacy, trading the top spot like heavyweight champions. Then in 1973, you reach your absolute peak. Your profit margins are the highest in the industry. Your breweries are the most efficient in the world. Wall Street calls you a model of corporate excellence. You've cracked the code, producing more beer, faster and cheaper than anyone else. But beneath this success, something sinister is happening. You've made a decision. A quiet decision that seems insignificant. You've changed your recipe. Not all at once, but slice by slice. Less barley, more chemicals, shorter fermentation, all for efficiency, for margins, for shareholders. And for a while, it works perfectly. The money rolls in. The stock climbs. But you've forgotten something crucial. Your customers built your empire with their loyalty and trust. Now, in less than a decade, everything will crumble. The factories will close. The crown will fall. The name that made Milwaukee famous will become a cautionary tale taught in every business school. This is the story of Schlitz Brewery and the fatal decision that destroyed America's biggest beer empire. Chapter 1: The Rise of an Empire. Our story begins in 1849 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city rapidly transforming into America's brewing capital. German immigrants were flooding into the heartland, bringing with them centuries of beer-making tradition. And among them was a young man who would build an empire. His name was Joseph Schlitz. Born in Mainz, Germany, Schlitz arrived in Milwaukee in 1850 with nothing but ambition and a background in accounting. He found work at a small brewery owned by August Krug, one of the many German brewers trying to make it in the New World. Schlitz wasn't a brewer by trade. He was a numbers man, meticulous with ledgers and finances. But he understood something crucial. Beer wasn't just about brewing, it was about business. Then, in 1856, tragedy struck. August Krug died suddenly, leaving behind a widow, Anna Maria, and a struggling brewery. Joseph Schlitz, now the most trusted employee, stepped up to manage the operation. 2 years later, in 1858, Schlitz married the widow Krug, and together they renamed the business the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company. It was a smart move, honoring the Krug legacy while establishing his own name. Under Schlitz's management, the brewery grew steadily, but it was still just one of many in a crowded Milwaukee market. Everything changed in 1871. On October 8th, the Great Chicago Fire erupted, consuming the city in flames for 3 devastating days. Over 300 people died. 100,000 were left homeless. And crucially for our story, most of Chicago's breweries were reduced to ash. The city was desperate for beer, not just as a beverage, but as one of the few safe drinks available when water sources were contaminated. Joseph Schlitz saw an opportunity that would define his legacy. He immediately loaded wagons with beer and sent them racing to Chicago. Not to sell, but to give away. Free beer for the victims. Free beer for the firefighters. Free beer for anyone trying to rebuild. It was marketed as an act of charity, a German brewer helping a sister city in its darkest hour. But it was also a stroke of marketing genius. Thousands of Chicagoans tasted Schlitz beer for the first time, and when they rebuilt their city, they remembered who had helped them. Schlitz became the beer of Chicago, and Chicago was about to become the second largest city in America. But Joseph Schlitz would never see the full fruits of his vision. In 1875, he boarded the steamship SS Schiller for a trip back to Germany to visit family. On May 7th, the ship struck rocks off the Isles of Scilly near Cornwall, England, and sank. Joseph Schlitz drowned along with over 300 other passengers. He was just 44 years old. The brewery he had built now passed to the Uihlein family, Anna Maria's nephews, The sons of August Krug's original partners, the Uhlans made a critical decision. They would keep the Schlitz name. They understood that Joseph Schlitz had transformed a local brewery into something much bigger, and his name carried weight. Under the Uhlans family's management, the brewery continued its meteoric rise. They invested heavily in new technology, expanded production capacity, and pioneered innovations that would transform the industry. One of their most important contributions was the introduction of brown glass bottles. Before this, most beer came in clear bottles, but the Uhlans discovered that sunlight could damage beer, creating off flavors. Brown glass protected the beer, keeping it fresher longer, a crucial advantage when shipping across the country. They also focused relentlessly on consistency and quality, understanding that their reputation depended on every bottle tasting exactly the same. By 1902, the impossible had happened. The Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company became the largest beer producer in the United States, brewing over 1 million barrels per year, a staggering achievement that no American brewery had reached before. They coined a slogan that would echo through the next century, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. It was bold, proud, and absolutely true. Schlitz had put Milwaukee on the map as the brewing capital of America. From a small operation run by a German immigrant accountant, Schlitz had risen to dominate an entire industry in just 50 years. This was the American dream made liquid and bottled. But empires, as history teaches us, are easier to build than to maintain. Chapter 2. The Golden Age. By the 1920s, Schlitz had been America's #1 brewer for nearly 2 decades. The Uhlans family had transformed Joseph Schlitz's vision into an industrial powerhouse, with massive brick breweries dominating the Milwaukee skyline. Workers took pride in saying they worked for Schlitz. It meant stability, good wages, and being part of something legendary. But then came a threat that would destroy weaker breweries and test even the strongest: Prohibition. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. It was a death sentence for the brewing industry. Overnight, the product that had built Milwaukee was outlawed. Smaller breweries shut down immediately, unable to adapt. Their equipment was sold for scrap, their buildings abandoned, their workers unemployed. But Schlitz had resources, and more importantly, they had foresight. The Uhlans understood that prohibition might be temporary, and they needed to survive until sanity returned. The first move was symbolic but crucial. They changed their name from the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company to the Joseph Schlitz Beverage Company. Brewing was illegal, but beverages were not. They retooled their massive factories to produce near beer, a non-alcoholic beverage that tasted vaguely like beer, but contained less than 0.5% alcohol. It was legal, barely profitable, and almost nobody liked it, but it kept the brand name alive and workers employed. More cleverly, Schlitz began producing malt syrup, marketed for baking and cooking. Of course, everyone knew what malt syrup was really for: home brewing. Families across America bought Schlitz malt syrup, took it home, and followed the convenient instructions that somehow appeared on the packaging to brew their own beer. Technically legal, morally questionable, but absolutely brilliant business. For 13 long years, Schlitz endured. Many of their competitors vanished. Pabst struggled. Miller barely survived. Anheuser-Busch clung to life producing ice cream and near beer, but Schlitz remained strong, their brand recognition intact, their distribution network preserved, their workforce ready. Then, on December 5, 1933, the impossible happened. The 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing prohibition. Beer was legal again. And Schlitz was ready. Within hours of repeal, Schlitz trucks were rolling. Within days, Schlitz beer was back on shelves across America. Within months, They had reclaimed their crown as the #1 brewer, not just in America, but in the entire world. The comeback was stunning. While competitors scrambled to restart operations, Schlitz simply flipped a switch. Their breweries roared back to life. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was famous once again. The 1940s and 50s became Schlitz's golden age. Post-war America was booming, and beer was booming with it. Milwaukee transformed into what would later be called the Silicon Valley of brewing, the absolute center of American beer production. 4 massive brewing empires dominated the city: Schlitz, Miller, Pabst, and Blatz. The competition was fierce, but there was enough thirst for everyone. Working at a Milwaukee brewery in those days meant something special. These weren't just jobs. They were careers, often spanning generations. A young man could start on the bottling line, work his way up, and retire decades later with a pension that would support his family. With a single brewery paycheck, workers bought homes in the suburbs, sent their kids to college, took family vacations. The American middle class was being built one beer at a time, and Milwaukee was proving that blue-collar work could provide a genuinely prosperous life. But Schlitz wasn't alone at the top. A rival was rising in St. Louis, Anheuser-Busch, makers of Budweiser. Throughout the 1950s, these two giants engaged in an epic battle for supremacy. One year, Schlitz would be #1. The next year, Budweiser would surge ahead. Then Schlitz would roar back. They traded the top spot like heavyweight boxers trading punches, neither willing to concede defeat. The competition drove both companies to innovate in marketing, distribution, and production. Schlitz advertisements appeared on every television, every radio station, every billboard. Budweiser matched them dollar for dollar. It became more than a business rivalry. It was regional pride. Schlitz represented Milwaukee, the gritty industrial heartland, the German brewing tradition. Budweiser represented St. Louis, the gateway to the West, American ambition. Beer had become part of American identity in the post-war years, and choosing your brand said something about who you were. Milwaukee had never been prouder. Their city produced the best beer in the world, employed tens of thousands, and stood as proof that American manufacturing could dominate globally. Schlitz seemed invincible, a permanent fixture at the top of American industry. But permanence is an illusion, and the decisions that would destroy this empire were already being made in boardrooms where profit margins mattered more than brewing tradition. Chapter 3: The Fatal Strike. The summer of 1953 started like any other in Milwaukee. The breweries were running at full capacity, churning out millions of barrels to quench America's insatiable thirst for beer. Schlitz was still trading blows with Budweiser for the #1 spot, and everything seemed secure. But beneath the surface, tension was building. The brewery workers, the men who manned the bottling lines, operated the massive copper kettles, and drove the delivery trucks, were growing restless. Wages hadn't kept pace with post-war inflation. Working conditions in the hot, dangerous breweries needed improvement. The unions were preparing for a fight, and management wasn't taking their demands seriously. On June 1st, 1953, it happened. Workers at Schlitz, Pabst, Blatz, and Miller walked off the job simultaneously. It wasn't just one brewery, it was all of them. Every major beer producer in Milwaukee shut down at once. The union's message was clear. If Milwaukee's brewers wanted to keep making beer, they needed to treat their workers fairly. What management thought would be a brief disruption turned into something far more catastrophic. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. 76 days, more than 2.5 months. Milwaukee's breweries sat silent and empty. The impact was immediate and devastating. Schlitz had built the most efficient distribution network in America, but it didn't matter if there was nothing to distribute. store shelves that had always been stocked with Schlitz began to empty. Bars ran out. Restaurants scrambled. Across the country, Americans who had been loyal Schlitz drinkers for years suddenly found themselves staring at empty coolers. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was nowhere to be found, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. In St. Louis, 300 miles south, the Anheuser-Busch breweries were running at full capacity. Their workers weren't on strike. Budweiser was flowing off the production lines by the millions of barrels, and August Busch Jr., the hard-charging CEO, saw an opportunity that would define his career. He ordered his sales force to flood into every market where Schlitz had vanished. Budweiser trucks appeared in neighborhoods that had been Schlitz territory for generations. Distributors who had always carried Schlitz were offered deals they couldn't refuse. Bars that had Schlitz on tap were persuaded to switch. And most importantly, Budweiser made sure that when a thirsty American walked into a store, there was always a cold six-pack of Bud waiting. At first, customers were reluctant. They wanted their Schlitz. But after a few weeks without it, they tried Budweiser, and something unexpected happened. They liked it. It wasn't that Budweiser was necessarily better, but it was there. It was cold, and it was familiar enough. Drinking habits, it turns out, are far more fragile than brand loyalty. When you can't get your preferred beer for weeks on end, you adapt. You find a new favorite. And once you've switched, once you've discovered that the other brand is perfectly fine, maybe even better, why switch back? The strike finally ended in August, after 76 brutal days. The workers got most of what they wanted: better wages, improved conditions, recognition of their value. It was a victory for labor. And in the long run, it was the right outcome. But for Schlitz, it was a disaster. They rushed to restart production, to flood the market, to win back their customers. And for a moment, it seemed to work. By 1954, through aggressive marketing and heavy promotional spending, Schlitz managed to reclaim the #1 spot. The executives breathed a sigh of relief. Crisis averted. The crown was back where it belonged. But something fundamental had changed. Budweiser hadn't just filled a temporary gap. They had broken the spell of Schlitz invincibility. Customers who had switched during the strike didn't all come back. New drinkers who had tried Budweiser first stayed with Budweiser, and Anheuser-Busch had learned that Schlitz could be beaten. They doubled down on marketing, on distribution, on innovation. By 1955, Budweiser surged ahead again. Schlitz fought back, reclaimed the lead briefly in '56, but then in 1957, Budweiser took the #1 position and never looked back. Never. For the rest of Schlitz's existence, they would be #2 at best. The lesson should have been obvious. Market share, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. Customer loyalty is not permanent. It's conditional on availability and consistency. In business, there's a saying, failure moves more share than success, meaning that your own failures hurt you more than your competitors' successes help them. Schlitz had failed to keep beer on the shelves, and customers had moved on. It was a warning sign, a red flag, a clear indication that brand loyalty could evaporate if you failed to deliver. But Schlitz management didn't internalize this lesson. They saw the strike as an unfortunate labor dispute, a temporary setback, nothing more. They were still #2. They were still massively profitable. They still had one of the most recognized brand names in America. Being #2 wasn't the end of the world. What they didn't realize was that they had just learned the wrong lesson. Instead of understanding that reliability and quality were paramount, they concluded that they needed to become more efficient, more cost-effective, more focused on profit margins. If they couldn't beat Budweiser in volume, they would beat them in profitability. And that thinking, that fatal shift from quality to efficiency, would set in motion the decisions that would destroy the entire empire. Chapter 4. the Maverick, and the CEO. Every great tragedy needs its architects, the people whose ambition, whose cleverness, whose absolute certainty in their own genius sets disaster in motion. For Schlitz, there were two men who would seal the empire's fate, though neither understood what they were doing until it was far too late. The first was Bob Martin. The second was Robert Uihlein Jr. Together they would make decisions that seemed brilliant on spreadsheets, but would prove catastrophic in reality. Bob Martin arrived at Schlitz in 1952, fresh out of college, with a degree and ambition that far exceeded his experience. He was hired as a junior analyst in the market research department at $300 a month, decent money for an entry-level position, but nothing special. Martin was young, hungry, and utterly convinced he was smarter than everyone around him. He had that dangerous combination of intelligence and impatience that makes some men rocket to the top and others crash spectacularly. In Martin's case, it would be both. Within 3 years, by 1955, Martin had been promoted to head of the research department. It was a stunning rise, and Martin himself later admitted the promotion said more about Schlitz's priorities than his abilities. In his own words, they didn't give a shit who ran the research department. Research wasn't glamorous. It wasn't where the real power was, but Martin saw it differently. He understood that information was power, that understanding consumer behavior could be weaponized, that marketing wasn't just about advertising, it was about control. And Martin was willing to do whatever it took to win. His approach to marketing was aggressive, creative, and frequently operated in what generous observers might call gray areas. Martin believed that rules were suggestions, that ethics were flexible, and that the only thing that mattered was results. He began building relationships with distributors, bar owners, and restaurant managers, relationships lubricated with gifts, favors, and carefully disguised payments. It wasn't quite bribery, Martin would insist. It was just good business. Everyone did it. And if you weren't willing to play the game, you'd lose to someone who was. Martin climbed the corporate ladder quickly, his methods delivering results that executives loved and his competitors envied. Then, in 1967, the second architect arrived. Robert Uihlein Jr. became chairman and CEO of Schlitz, the third generation of his family to run the brewery. The Uihleins had been there from the beginning, had built Schlitz from a small operation into the second largest brewer in America. But Robert Jr. was different from his predecessors. The earlier Uihleins had been brewers at heart, men who understood that beer was a craft, that reputation mattered, that you built loyalty through consistency and quality. Robert Jr. was a businessman in the modern sense, a man who saw beer as a product, brewing as a manufacturing process, and the company as a machine to be optimized for maximum financial output. His philosophy was elegantly simple and utterly destructive. If Schlitz couldn't be number one in market share, they would be number one in profit margin. He looked at the competition with Budweiser and concluded they were fighting the wrong battle. Anheuser-Busch could outspend them on marketing, could build more breweries, could expand distribution. Fine. Let them have volume. Schlitz would focus on efficiency, on extracting maximum profit from every barrel produced. It was a strategy that Wall Street loved. Shareholders loved it, analysts loved it, and it would destroy everything. Uihlein invested millions in IBM computer systems to analyze every aspect of production, to identify inefficiencies, to optimize processes. He hired experts from Anheuser-Busch, studying how his competitors achieved success, looking for any edge. He developed a philosophy he called salami slicing, the idea that you could make small changes, slice by slice, that individually seemed insignificant but collectively transformed the business. Change one ingredient by 5%, nobody notices. Speed up fermentation by 10%, who can tell? Replace one component with a cheaper alternative. Consumers won't know the difference. It was incrementalism weaponized against quality. The dangerous part was that Uihlein genuinely believed technology could replace tradition, that chemistry could substitute for craft, that efficiency and quality were not in opposition, but could be achieved simultaneously. He looked at the old brewing methods, the long fermentation times, the expensive ingredients, the careful aging, and saw waste. Modern science, he believed, could produce the same beer faster and cheaper. The brewing masters, the men who had spent decades learning their craft, were dismissed as old-fashioned. The new generation of managers believed in data, in optimization, in progress. In the 1960s, Schlitz built a state-of-the-art brewery in Baldwinsville, New York, equipped with continuous fermentation technology. It was the future of brewing, they announced proudly. They called their beer the most carefully brewed beer in the world, emphasizing the precision, the control, the scientific approach. But that phrase, carefully brewed, was doing heavy linguistic lifting. What they meant was efficiently brewed. What they meant was cheaply brewed. Carefully implied quality, but the reality was cost-cutting dressed in the language of innovation. Bob Martin, now senior vice president overseeing all marketing, loved it. His aggressive, boundary-pushing sales tactics, combined with Uihlein's efficiency obsession, created a feedback loop of terrible ideas, validated by short-term success. Revenue was up. Profit margins were increasing. Stock prices were climbing. Every metric that mattered to executives and shareholders was moving in the right direction. What they couldn't see, or chose not to see, was what was happening to the beer itself, and more importantly, what would happen when customers noticed. The machinery of destruction was humming along smoothly, and the men operating it thought they were geniuses. Chapter 5. The Peak. Deceptive Success. By 1970, Robert Eiling Jr.'s vision seemed to be working perfectly. Schlitz was still number 2 behind Budweiser, but the gap was closing. Market share was growing faster than Anheuser-Busch, faster than Miller, faster than anyone. Revenue was climbing at double-digit rates year after year. The stock price was soaring. Wall Street analysts were falling over themselves to praise Schlitz's management, calling them visionaries who had cracked the code of modern brewing. Investment reports glowed with phrases like operational excellence and margin expansion and strategic positioning. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt perfect. And that's what made it so dangerous. Then came 1973, the absolute peak. This was the year when Schlitz could genuinely claim to have the most efficient breweries in the world. Their profit-to-sales ratio was the highest in the industry, beating even Budweiser. Their brewery capacity utilization exceeded industry averages by significant margins, meaning they were squeezing more production out of their facilities than competitors thought possible. Their market share growth rate was accelerating, actually gaining ground on Budweiser for the first time in over a decade. Investors were euphoric. Financial magazines ran profiles on Schlitz executives, praising their innovative approach. Business schools began studying Schlitz as a model of corporate transformation. The company that had lost the crown in the 1950s had seemingly found a new path to dominance, not through tradition, but through technology and efficiency. On the surface, it was a showcase of corporate brilliance. The Milwaukee breweries had been modernized with the latest equipment. The Baldwinsville facility in New York was a technological marvel, its continuous fermentation system allowing beer to be produced faster than traditional batch methods. IBM computer systems monitored every stage of production, making micro-adjustments to optimize yield and reduce waste. Production costs had been slashed to record lows. They marketed their process as accelerated batch fermentation, ABF for short, making it sound cutting-edge and scientific. In advertising, they called it accurate balanced fermentation, implying precision and quality. The language was carefully chosen to sound innovative rather than rushed, efficient rather than cheap. But behind the gleaming stainless steel and the blinking computer displays, something very different was happening. The beer that built the Schlitz empire was gone. Not improved, not modernized, gone. Replaced. The formula had been changed so fundamentally that calling it the same beer was almost fraudulent. Where traditional Schlitz had used malted barley as its primary grain, the new formula relied heavily on corn syrup, which was 30% cheaper but produced a thinner, less flavorful beer. Fresh hops, which gave beer its distinctive aroma and bitterness, had been replaced with hop pellets and hop extracts, cheaper, more shelf-stable, but lacking the complexity and character of the real thing. Most crucially, they had slashed the fermentation time. Traditional brewing required patience. Beer needed time to ferment properly, typically around 40 days for a quality lager, followed by aging to develop flavor and smoothness. Schlitz had cut that to 15 days. 15. They weren't aging the beer at all. The continuous fermentation system meant beer went from grain to bottle in a fraction of the traditional time. Chemically, it was beer. Legally, it was beer. But by any traditional brewing standard, it was an abomination, a rushed, incomplete product that hadn't been given time to develop properly. The rushed fermentation created another problem. The beer developed a haze when refrigerated, a cloudy appearance that consumers associated with spoilage or contamination. The solution? Add silica gel to the brewing process. Silica gel acted as a clarifying agent, binding to the proteins that caused the haze and allowing them to be filtered out. It worked. The beer looked clear and appealing, but it was a chemical band-aid on a fundamental quality problem, and using silica gel in beer production was controversial at best. Schlitz kept it quiet, buried in the technical specifications that regulators saw but consumers didn't. What's remarkable is that warning signs were everywhere, but they were systematically ignored. The most damning came from Hawaii. In 1964, Schlitz had purchased Primo Brewery, a local Hawaiian beer brand. By 1971, Primo dominated the Hawaiian market with 70% share, an incredible achievement on islands where local preference was strong. Then Schlitz decided to apply their efficiency model. Instead of brewing Primo fresh in Hawaii, they would ship dehydrated wort from California, add water in Hawaii, and package it locally. On paper, it was brilliant. Massive cost savings with minimal infrastructure. In reality, it was a disaster. Hawaiian consumers immediately noticed the difference. The beer tasted wrong. It wasn't quite right. Complaints started trickling in, then flooding in. Local bars reported customers refusing to order Primo, switching to mainland brands, or even to cheaper alternatives. The loyalty that had taken decades to build evaporated in months. By 1975, Primo's market share had collapsed from 70% to just 20%, a catastrophic decline in only 4 years. It should have been a flashing red alarm. It should have prompted an immediate investigation into whether Schlitz's cost-cutting measures were destroying the brand. It should have caused executives to question their entire strategy, but it didn't. Nobody learned anything from Hawaii. Or more accurately, the people making decisions chose not to learn. The Hawaii disaster was dismissed as a regional quirk, a unique situation that didn't apply to the mainland market. After all, Hawaiian consumers were different, more sensitive to local production, more attuned to subtle changes. Mainland Americans, the thinking went, wouldn't notice. They were less sophisticated, more swayed by marketing than taste. And besides, the profit numbers were too good to question. Revenue was up, margins were expanding, stock prices were hitting new highs. Every quarterly earnings report was better than the last. Why would you second-guess a winning formula? This is the terrible seduction of financial success. When the numbers look good, when investors are happy, when bonuses are flowing, it becomes almost impossible to acknowledge that you might be destroying the foundation of your business. The spreadsheet said Schlitz was winning. The efficiency metrics said they were brilliant. Wall Street said they were the future of brewing. And so the executives convinced themselves that the beer was fine, that consumers wouldn't notice, that technology and marketing could paper over any quality concerns. They had optimized themselves into a corner, and they couldn't see the cliff they were about to drive off. 1973 was the peak, the highest point before the fall. And nobody realized they were already in free fall. Chapter 6. The Underground Empire. While Robert Eileen Jr. was engineering his efficiency revolution in the breweries, Bob Martin was building an empire of his own, a shadow network of influence, bribery, and questionable deals that spread across America like a web. By the mid-1970s, Martin had risen to senior vice president, commanding Schlitz's entire marketing apparatus with near absolute authority. He had the budget, the connections, and most dangerously, the conviction that he was doing what needed to be done. Martin's philosophy was elegantly simple and morally bankrupt. The ends justify the means. If Schlitz couldn't beat Budweiser on quality or production capacity, they would win through superior positioning, aggressive tactics, and by making sure that when a customer walked into a bar, Schlitz was the easiest beer to order. This wasn't advertising in the traditional sense. This was warfare, economic warfare fought in the shadows of America's bars, restaurants, airports, and stadiums. Martin built a nationwide network of relationships with distributors, bar owners, restaurant managers, and venue operators. These weren't partnerships built on the quality of Schlitz beer. They were transactional arrangements, lubricated with cash, gifts, and favors that existed in the murky gray zone between legitimate business and outright corruption. Martin called it the payola for beer system, and it was devastatingly effective. The core strategy was simple: controlled the taps. In the beer business, draft beer from taps represents premium positioning and higher profit margins. If your beer dominated the taps at a popular bar or restaurant, you controlled that account. Martin's goal was to ensure Schlitz occupied 5 out of every 6 taps wherever beer was served. To achieve this, Schlitz offered bar owners what they called promotional support. A struggling bar needed new carpeting? Schlitz would pay for it. A restaurant wanted to renovate their floors? Schlitz had a budget for that. New furniture, new lighting, cosmetic improvements. Schlitz became a silent partner in upgrading establishments across the country. The only condition was simple: make sure Schlitz dominated your beer selection. These weren't legitimate advertising expenses. These were bribes dressed up as business investments. The money was carefully laundered through advertising agencies and consulting contracts that existed primarily on paper. A bar owner would be introduced to a marketing consultant who would arrange for renovations or equipment paid for by funds that originated with Schlitz but passed through enough intermediaries to obscure the trail. The bar owner got improvements they couldn't otherwise afford. Schlitz got guaranteed tap placement. Everyone was happy, and technically, no one was breaking any laws, or at least that's what Martin told himself. One of Martin's most audacious moves came in the 1960s with the Houston Astrodome. Judge Roy Hofheinz was building what he called the eighth wonder of the world, the first domed sports stadium, a massive engineering project that was running over budget. Hofheinz needed $225,000 immediately, but Texas law prohibited him from borrowing money from companies that sponsored broadcasts of Astros games, and Schlitz was a major sponsor. Martin saw an opportunity and engineered what he called a creative solution. Schlitz simply prepaid their advertising fees for the next quarter. It wasn't technically a loan. It was an advance payment for services to be rendered. The lawyers signed off. The accountants approved it. Hofheinz got his money, and Schlitz secured exclusive beer rights at the Astrodome for years to come. It was questionable at best, likely illegal, but impossible to prosecute because it had been structured so cleverly. Then came the Chicago O'Hare Airport takeover in 1976, which demonstrated both Martin's tactical brilliance and his complete disregard for fair competition. O'Hare was the busiest airport in the world, and the draft beer account was worth millions. Budweiser had long dominated O'Hare's taps, but that summer, Budweiser workers went on strike. The airport faced a beer shortage during peak travel season. Martin swooped in, positioned Schlitz as the savior, and provided emergency supplies to keep O'Hare's bars operational. Airport management was grateful. Travelers were grateful. And when the crisis passed, somehow every single beer tap at O'Hare poured Schlitz. Not most of them, all of them. Budweiser, Miller, and every other competitor had been completely shut out of one of the most valuable accounts in America. It was a masterpiece of opportunistic business, and almost certainly involved payments and agreements that would never appear in official contracts. Martin's network grew to encompass hundreds of similar arrangements across the country. Sports stadiums, convention centers, hotel chains, restaurant groups, anywhere beer was served, Martin worked to secure Schlitz's dominance through a combination of legitimate marketing, aggressive negotiation, and when necessary, under-the-table payments. His team became expert at identifying decision-makers, understanding their needs, and making offers that were hard to refuse. The beauty of the system, from Martin's perspective, was that it was decentralized enough to be deniable. If one deal came under scrutiny, it could be explained away as an isolated incident, a local manager exceeding their authority, a misunderstanding of company policy. But Martin made one catastrophic mistake, a mistake that would eventually bring down his entire operation and contribute to Schlitz's destruction. He documented everything. In direct violation of Schlitz's own record-keeping policies, Martin's department maintained detailed files of every questionable transaction, every under-the-table payment, every gray area deal. There were receipts for carpets installed at nightclubs, invoices for consulting fees that were clearly kickbacks, and contracts with advertising agencies that existed primarily to launder payments to bar owners. One particularly damning example would later come to light: a payment of $1,208 for carpeting at a nightclub called Humpin' Hannah's, routed through an advertising agency to disguise its true purpose. Why keep such meticulous records of potentially illegal activity? Perhaps it was habit. Martin had started in research, where documentation was everything. Perhaps it was insurance, proof that his superiors had approved these expenses should anything go wrong. Or perhaps it was simply arrogance, the belief that he was untouchable, that Schlitz was too powerful, that the system he'd built was too valuable to be questioned. Whatever the reason, filing cabinets in Schlitz's Milwaukee headquarters contained a comprehensive archive of corporate malfeasance, a paper trail that would make any prosecutor's job laughably easy. It was a ticking time bomb. As long as Robert Eilein Jr. was alive and in charge, Martin was protected. Eilein knew about the gray areas, had likely approved many of them, and as long as the sales numbers justified the expenses, he wasn't asking difficult questions. But empires built on corruption are inherently unstable. They depend on secrecy, on loyalty, on the protection of powerful allies. And when those conditions change, when the spotlight turns in your direction, the whole structure can collapse with stunning speed. Martin's underground empire was about to be dragged into the light, and the exposure would prove almost as destructive as the quality problems that were simultaneously destroying Schlitz's beer. Chapter 7. The Snot Beer Crisis. In 1976, the house of cards that Robert Eilein Jr. had built finally began to collapse. The trigger came from an unexpected source: the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA announced they were considering new labeling requirements that would force brewers to list all ingredients on their packaging. It sounds reasonable, even mundane. Consumers have a right to know what they're drinking. But for Schlitz, it was a potential catastrophe. Because if they had to list silica gel as an ingredient, customers would start asking questions. What is silica gel? Why is it in my beer? And most dangerously, what else have you changed? Panic spread through Schlitz headquarters. The silica gel had been their secret solution to the haze problem caused by rushed fermentation. It worked perfectly from a technical standpoint. The beer looked clear and appealing. But it was also a visible symbol of everything they'd been hiding. If consumers learned that Schlitz was using industrial chemicals to fix problems created by cost-cutting, the narrative would write itself. Schlitz had sacrificed quality for profit and was using chemistry to cover it up. The PR disaster would be immense. Oylein called an emergency meeting of his top brewing engineers and chemists. The mandate was clear and urgent. Find a replacement for silica gel, and find it now. The solution they landed on was called ChillGuard, and on paper, it was brilliant. ChillGuard would perform the same function as silica gel, preventing the protein haze that made beer look cloudy, but with one crucial advantage. Unlike silica gel, which remained in the finished beer, ChillGuard could be added during production and then filtered out completely before bottling. If it wasn't in the final product, it didn't need to be listed on the label. Problem solved. The chemical engineers assured management it would work. The brewing team ran some basic tests. Everything looked fine. Oylein gave the approval, and Schlitz began substituting ChillGuard for silica gel across all their breweries. Nobody thought to conduct long-term stability tests. Nobody considered how ChillGuard might interact with other additives in the beer over weeks or months. They needed a solution immediately, and ChillGuard appeared to be it. What happened next was a chemical horror show. ChillGuard reacted catastrophically with another additive Schlitz used, a foam stabilizer designed to give their beer a thick, appealing head. The reaction caused protein flocculation, a technical term for proteins clumping together into visible, disgusting chunks. Bottles and cans of Schlitz that had looked perfectly clear when they left the brewery began developing white, slimy particles, floating in the beer within weeks. Customers opened bottles and saw what looked like mucus. They poured beer into glasses and watched white chunks settle to the bottom. The beer didn't just look wrong. It tasted wrong, smelled wrong, felt wrong in the mouth. Drinkers started calling it Snot beer, and the nickname spread like wildfire. The complaints started as a trickle and quickly became a flood. Bars called distributors, demanding they take back cases of Schlitz. Retailers pulled six-packs off shelves as customers brought them back, disgusted and angry. Letters poured into Schlitz headquarters. There's white chunks floating in my beer. This tastes like chemicals. What the hell did you do to Schlitz? The media picked up the story, and suddenly it was everywhere. Local news stations ran segments showing the contaminated beer. Newspapers published photos of the white floccules. Consumer advocacy groups called for investigations. The headlines wrote themselves: Schlitz beer recall, quality problems at major brewer. What's in your Schlitz? Schlitz had no choice but to issue a massive recall. 10 million bottles and cans had to be pulled from distribution, an unprecedented disaster for a major brewer. The direct cost was $1.4 million, equivalent to about $6.3 million in today's money. But the financial cost was trivial compared to the reputational damage. In a matter of weeks, Schlitz transformed from a premium brand to a punchline. Comedians made jokes about it. Competing brands referenced it in their advertising. The nicknames proliferated: Snot beer, green beer, cheap beer, garbage beer. Word of mouth, which had once been Schlitz's greatest asset, became their executioner. People told their friends, who told their friends, who told their friends. The story spread exponentially. Don't buy Schlitz. It's gross. They ruined it. Something's wrong with their beer. What made the crisis particularly devastating was the betrayal factor. This wasn't a new brand making mistakes as it found its footing. This was Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, a brand that had existed for over a century, that people's grandfathers had drunk, that was supposed to represent quality and consistency. The discovery that Schlitz had been cutting corners, using questionable additives, and producing inferior beer felt like a personal betrayal to loyal customers. They hadn't just bought a bad product, they'd been lied to. The trust that had been built over generations evaporated in a matter of weeks. And then came the unthinkable. Milwaukee itself, the city whose name was literally in Schlitz's slogan, turned its back on the beer. For over 100 years, Milwaukee residents had drunk Schlitz with civic pride. Working at Schlitz was prestigious. Serving Schlitz meant you were supporting local industry. But after the Snot beer crisis, even Milwaukee loyalty couldn't survive. Local bars switched to other brands. Milwaukee workers stopped ordering Schlitz at the corner tap. Families who had drunk nothing but Schlitz for 3 generations quietly started buying Budweiser or Miller or Pabst. The beer that made Milwaukee famous had become the beer that made Milwaukee embarrassed. The speed of the collapse was shocking. 100 years of loyalty, destroyed in months. Schlitz executives tried to reassure customers, running advertisements claiming the problem was solved, that quality was restored, that Schlitz was still the same great beer it had always been. But nobody believed them anymore. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. Every time someone saw a Schlitz advertisement, they thought of white chunks floating in beer. Every time they walked past Schlitz in a store, they remembered the recall. The brand had been poisoned, not by bad beer alone, but by the revelation of corporate dishonesty. The clear evidence that Schlitz had been willing to sacrifice quality for profit, to use chemical tricks to hide their cost-cutting, to lie to consumers who had trusted them for generations. The Snot beer crisis was the moment when Schlitz's long deception caught up with them, and the consequences would prove terminal. Chapter 8. Marketing Disaster. By early 1977, Schlitz was in full panic mode. The Snot beer crisis had devastated their reputation. Market share was in free fall, dropping month after month as consumers fled to competitors. Budweiser and Miller were publicly mocking Schlitz in their advertising, barely concealing their glee at watching the former giant stumble. Distributors and retailers were losing confidence, quietly shifting shelf space and promotional support to brands they could trust. Sales meetings became grim affairs, where executives confronted devastating charts showing just how quickly the empire was crumbling. Something had to be done, and it had to be dramatic. The brand needed saving, and it needed saving now. Schlitz made a decision that seemed logical at the time, but would prove catastrophically wrong. They hired Leo Burnett and Company, one of the most prestigious advertising agencies in the world. This was the firm that had created the Marlboro Man, transforming a women's cigarette into the epitome of masculine cool. They'd invented Tony the Tiger for Kellogg's Frosted Flakes and the Jolly Green Giant for vegetables. If anyone could resurrect a damaged brand through sheer creative brilliance, it was Leo Burnett. Schlitz gave them an unlimited budget and a desperate brief. Prove to America that Schlitz drinkers are loyal, that the brand still matters, that real customers would never abandon their beer. The concept Leo Burnett developed was meant to showcase unwavering loyalty. The idea was to show Schlitz drinkers so devoted to their brand that they would become genuinely upset, even aggressive, if offered a substitute. These weren't just customers, they were fanatics. People who identified so deeply with Schlitz that asking them to drink something else was a personal insult. On paper, in the conference room, surrounded by creative professionals nodding enthusiastically, it probably seemed brilliant. A bold statement of brand loyalty, edgy, memorable. Different from the usual soft-sell beer advertising, in reality, it was one of the worst advertising campaigns in American history. 4 television commercials were produced, each following the same template. The camera shows you, the viewer, offering a Schlitz drinker a different beer, and their reaction ranges from insulted to homicidal. The first commercial featured a boxer, all muscle and intimidation, staring at the camera with barely controlled rage. You've just handed him a beer that isn't Schlitz, and he's not happy about it. "You want to take away my gusto?" he growls, using Schlitz's slogan in a way that sounds more like a threat than a tagline. The camera zooms in on his clenched fists, his angry face. The message is clear. Give this man the wrong beer, and he might just hurt you. The second commercial went even further. A lumberjack, massive and bearded, stands next to his pet mountain lion. You offer him a beer that isn't Schlitz, and he smiles, but it's not a friendly smile. He gestures to the big cat. "He hasn't eaten today," the lumberjack says, letting the implication hang in the air. "Wanna be his dinner?" The mountain lion roars at the camera, right on cue. The message? Drink Schlitz, or become cat food. The third featured a construction worker, another archetype of blue-collar masculinity. When offered the wrong beer, he delivers a line that would become infamous. "You want me to drink that instead of Schlitz? I'm going to play Picasso and put you on the canvas." It took viewers a moment to understand the metaphor. He's saying he'll paint you with your own blood. The threatening body language left no doubt about his sincerity. Even the fourth commercial, featuring actress Terry Garr as a bartender, followed the same disturbing template. A customer orders a different beer, and she leans in with a menacing expression. "My customers will kill you if I serve them that. They only drink Schlitz here." It was meant to be playful, perhaps, but came across as genuinely threatening. The slogan tying it all together was, "If you don't have Schlitz, you don't have gusto." But what viewers heard was something entirely different. What they took away from these commercials was a simple, terrifying message. Drink Schlitz, or we'll kill you. Not suggested, not implied, stated clearly through violence and intimidation. The campaign wasn't selling beer, it was making threats. The public reaction was immediate and universally negative. Viewers didn't feel persuaded. They felt threatened and insulted. Letters and phone calls flooded Schlitz headquarters. And for once, they weren't complaining about beer quality. They were asking a simple, devastating question. "Are you seriously threatening to hurt me if I don't buy your product?" Late-night television shows ran parodies. Comedians had a field day. Competing brands referenced it in their own advertising, thanking Schlitz for making their jobs easier. Media coverage was brutal, with advertising critics using the campaign as an example of corporate desperation and tone deafness. The campaign earned a nickname that would haunt Schlitz forever, the "Drink Schlitz or I'll Kill You" campaign. It became shorthand for everything wrong with the company. Aggressive, desperate, unable to read the room, fundamentally misunderstanding their own customers. Within 10 weeks, Schlitz pulled the commercials. 10 weeks. For a major national campaign with an unlimited budget from one of the world's premier agencies, 10 weeks was an admission of total failure. Leo Burnett was fired, their sterling reputation tarnished by association with the disaster. But the damage was done. Instead of rescuing Schlitz's image, the campaign had made everything worse. The brand wasn't just associated with bad beer anymore. It was associated with violence, desperation, and profound corporate dysfunction. Sales didn't stabilize, they dropped even faster. The commercials became case studies in marketing programs across the country, taught alongside New Coke as examples of what not to do. Professors would show the ads to students and ask them to identify every mistake, every misjudgment, every point where someone should have said stop. What makes the campaign particularly tragic is that it revealed just how disconnected Schlitz leadership had become from reality. They thought intimidation would convey loyalty. They thought aggression would demonstrate passion. They fundamentally misunderstood that people don't want to be threatened into buying beer. They want to be persuaded, entertained, made to feel good about their choices. The campaign was a window into Schlitz's corporate culture, arrogant, tone-deaf, willing to try anything except addressing the fundamental problem that their beer had become inferior. You can't advertise your way out of a quality crisis, especially with ads that make viewers actively dislike your brand. Schlitz had tried, and in doing so, they'd accelerated their own destruction. Chapter 9. The House of Cards Falls. In the midst of the Snot beer crisis, another disaster struck Schlitz, one that would remove the last protection shielding Bob Martin's underground empire from scrutiny. In 1976, Robert Uihlein Jr. died of leukemia. The man who had driven Schlitz's efficiency revolution, who had approved or at least tolerated Martin's questionable tactics, who had prioritized profit margins above all else, was gone. His death created a power vacuum at exactly the wrong time. The new leadership consisted of Eugene Peters, an accountant, and Daniel McKeithen, a geologist. Both were capable executives, but neither had been part of Uihlein's inner circle. Neither knew about the darker aspects of how Schlitz competed. Neither had any loyalty to Bob Martin, and neither had any idea what was hiding in the filing cabinets at Schlitz headquarters. The discovery came almost by accident. A young corporate lawyer was conducting a routine document review, the kind of tedious work that junior attorneys get stuck with, going through old files to ensure compliance with record retention policies. In one of the storage rooms, he found filing cabinets that shouldn't have been there, filled with documents that violated company policy about what could be kept and what should be destroyed. As he began reading through the files, his confusion turned to alarm, then to horror. These weren't normal business records. They were detailed accounts of payoffs, bribes, and kickbacks stretching back to the 1960s. There were receipts for carpets installed in nightclubs, invoices for consulting services that were transparently fake, contracts with advertising agencies that existed primarily to launder payments to bar owners. Every questionable deal Martin had made, every gray area transaction, every bribe disguised as a promotional expense, it was all there, documented in meticulous detail. The young lawyer must have sat there, holding these files, thinking, "Oh my God, this company is going to be destroyed." He had a choice. He could quietly destroy the evidence, pretend he never saw it, protect the company from the fallout, or he could report it up the chain of command and let the chips fall where they may. To his credit, he chose honesty. He brought the files to senior management, and suddenly, Schlitz's new leadership faced an impossible situation. They were holding evidence of systematic corporate corruption spanning more than a decade. If they reported it, they'd trigger investigations that could destroy the company. If they buried it, and it came out later, and it would come out, the consequences would be even worse. Before they could decide, the decision was made for them. Someone, it's never been definitively established who, provided an anonymous tip to federal authorities. The FBI opened an investigation into what they delicately termed questionable marketing practices at Schlitz. Agents began interviewing bar owners in cities across America, asking about their relationships with Schlitz representatives. They talked to distributors, suppliers, venue managers, anyone who might have been part of Martin's network. The agents were thorough, professional, and relentless. A pattern emerged quickly. Schlitz had been operating a nationwide bribery scheme, using promotional budgets and advertising funds to funnel money to anyone who could influence beer purchasing decisions. Subpoenas were issued. Documents were seized. Bob Martin's carefully constructed empire began crumbling as witnesses, facing federal charges themselves, cooperated with investigators. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates publicly traded companies and has broad authority over corporate fraud, took over the investigation. By 1977, they had built an overwhelming case. the SEC filed hundreds of charges against Schlitz, documenting violations across multiple states, systematic misrepresentation of expenses, and a culture of corruption that had infected the company's sales and marketing operations for years. The Milwaukee Sentinel got hold of the story and published it on the front page. The details were damning and specific. $1,208 for carpets at a nightclub called Humpin' Hannah's, routed through an advertising agency to disguise the payment's true purpose. Fake consulting contracts, paying thousands to bar owners in exchange for tap placement. Inflated advertising fees that were clearly kickbacks. Promotional expenses that bore no relationship to actual promotions. The paper trail was extensive, detailed, and impossible to deny. Schlitz, the company that claimed to represent Milwaukee values, had been buying its market share through systematic bribery. Bob Martin's response to the scandal was a masterclass in deflection and denial. He claimed he had done nothing wrong, characterizing the payments as questionable marketing practices, rather than the kickbacks they obviously were. He blamed overzealous people in the marketing department, conveniently forgetting that he was the head of that department, the person who had designed and overseen these programs for years. He insisted that this was simply how business was done, that everyone in the industry operated the same way, that Schlitz was being singled out unfairly. He refused to accept any personal responsibility, painting himself as a scapegoat for standard industry practices that everyone knew about but nobody talked about publicly. Nobody was buying it. The evidence was too clear, too detailed, too overwhelming. In 1978, Schlitz reached a settlement with the SEC. They admitted to the violations without formally admitting guilt. The standard corporate compromise that allows companies to pay fines and move on without creating legal liability for future lawsuits. They paid massive penalties, and they fired Bob Martin. His career at Schlitz, which had lasted over 2 decades and seen him rise from a junior analyst to one of the most powerful executives in the company, ended in disgrace. Remarkably, Martin would later sue Schlitz for defamation and win, arguing that the company had unfairly blamed him for practices that had been approved at the highest levels. He was probably right about that. Uihlein had almost certainly known and approved. But that didn't make Martin any less guilty. The public reaction was swift and merciless. The beer that made Milwaukee famous became, in headlines and conversations across America, the beer that bribed America. Shareholders, already furious about the quality problems and plummeting sales, now learned that management had been systematically corrupt. The stock price, which had been falling for months, went into free fall. Distributors and dealers who had stuck with Schlitz through the Snot beer crisis now abandoned the brand entirely. Why would they continue doing business with a company that had been bribing their competitors, that had been caught lying about promotional expenses that clearly couldn't be trusted? But perhaps the worst damage was to consumer trust. Average beer drinkers, people who had no idea what payola was or how kickbacks worked, understood one simple truth. Schlitz had been cheating. They'd been buying their market position rather than earning it through quality. Every bar that served primarily Schlitz, every restaurant where Schlitz dominated the taps, every venue where competing brands mysteriously weren't available, now consumers knew why. It wasn't because Schlitz was better. It was because Schlitz had paid for that placement, either directly or through carefully disguised bribes. The company that had claimed to represent tradition, quality, and Milwaukee values had been built on corruption. Trust, already badly damaged by the quality crisis, was now completely destroyed. There was no coming back from this. Chapter 10. The Death Spiral. In 1976, despite all the problems brewing beneath the surface, Schlitz still held the number 2 position in American brewing with 18% market share. They were still the second largest brewer in America, behind only Anheuser-Busch. Revenue exceeded $1 billion. The company was profitable. Distribution was strong. From the outside, Schlitz still looked like a giant. Then everything collapsed. And the speed of that collapse would become legendary in business schools as one of the fastest corporate implosions in American history. 1977 brought the first major blow. Miller surged past Schlitz to claim the number 2 spot, dropping Schlitz to third. Miller Lite, launched in 1975, was revolutionizing the industry and capturing a massive share of the growing light beer market. Schlitz tried to counter with Schlitz Light, but it was a catastrophic failure. Consumers who had lost faith in regular Schlitz weren't about to trust a light version from the same company. The response was brutal and consistent. I don't trust Schlitz quality anymore. Market share plummeted from 18% to 14% in a single year, a loss that represented billions in revenue and hundreds of millions in market value. By 1978, Schlitz was caught in a perfect storm. The quality crisis was still fresh in consumers' minds. The corruption scandal was splashed across newspapers. The threatening advertising campaign had made them a laughingstock. Sales weren't just declining, they were collapsing at 20 to 30% annually. Dealers were refusing to stock Schlitz, using their limited shelf space for brands customers actually wanted to buy. Bars were removing Schlitz taps, tired of pouring beer down drains when nobody ordered it. Consumers were switching to competitors in massive numbers, and they weren't coming back. Market share dropped from 14% to 10%. The death spiral had begun. 1979 saw Pabst, another Milwaukee brewer and longtime rival, surge past the flailing Schlitz. The company that had been number 2 just 3 years earlier was now number 4. The Washington Post ran a feature story with the headline, "Fight to Regain Gusto," documenting Schlitz's desperate struggle for survival. Harvard Business School turned Schlitz into a case study asking MBA students, what should Schlitz do? The general consensus among future business leaders was grim. Probably nothing can save it now. Market share fell again from 10% to 7%. Wall Street had given up on Schlitz entirely. Then came 1980, and an almost unthinkable milestone. G. Heilemann Brewing Company, a regional player that most Americans had never heard of, overtook Schlitz in market share. Schlitz was now number 5. Read that again. From number 2 to number 5 in just 4 years. The company was operating deeply in the red, hemorrhaging money on every barrel produced. Losses were massive and accelerating. The stock, once a blue-chip investment that represented stability and steady dividends, was essentially worthless. Market share had fallen to 5% and was still declining. Schlitz wasn't just losing, they were dying in real time. The beer industry itself was transforming in ways that left Schlitz behind. Miller Lite's success had triggered a light beer revolution. By the early 80s, light beer represented 30% of the market and was growing rapidly. Anheuser-Busch launched Bud Light in 1982 and immediately captured massive market share. But Schlitz couldn't participate in this boom. Their light beer had failed spectacularly because consumers fundamentally didn't trust anything with the Schlitz name on it. If Schlitz had ruined their regular beer, why would anyone believe their light beer was any good? The fastest-growing segment of the industry was closed to them, not because they couldn't brew light beer, but because their brand was poison. In desperation, Schlitz made one final attempt to save itself. They hired Frank Sellinger, a former Anheuser-Busch brewmaster with an impeccable reputation, as CEO. Sellinger knew exactly what needed to be done. He immediately returned to traditional brewing methods, real malted barley, fresh hops, proper fermentation times, careful aging. He threw out the accelerated processes, the cheap substitutes, all the cost-cutting measures that had destroyed the beer's quality. Within months, Schlitz beer actually tasted good again. Independent taste tests confirmed it. The product had been fixed, but it didn't matter. The brutal truth about brand destruction is that quality alone can't rebuild trust. Consumers had been burned. They'd bought Snot beer, they'd seen the corruption scandal, they'd been threatened by advertising. The phrase "once bitten, twice shy" perfectly captured the market's response. People weren't willing to give Schlitz a second chance. Word of mouth, which spreads faster and carries more weight than any advertising, was unanimously negative. Don't buy Schlitz. I don't care what they say now, it's crap. They ruined it. Even objectively, good beer couldn't overcome a reputation for being garbage. Trust takes decades to build and seconds to destroy, and Schlitz had thoroughly destroyed theirs. Then came the final symbolic blow. In June 1981, 700 workers at the Milwaukee flagship brewery walked off the job when their union contract expired without a replacement agreement. The strike dragged on for nearly 4 months. Schlitz, bleeding money and facing potential bankruptcy, made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. They decided to close the Milwaukee brewery permanently, not temporarily during the strike, permanently, forever. The symbolism was devastating. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was abandoning Milwaukee. The company that had defined the city's identity for over 130 years, that had employed generations of Milwaukee families, that had put Milwaukee on the map as America's brewing capital, was leaving. The hometown that had stayed loyal longer than anywhere else was being betrayed. Workers who had dedicated their entire careers to Schlitz, whose fathers and grandfathers had worked there, were suddenly unemployed with nowhere to go. The city went into shock. Milwaukee had built its identity around brewing, and now its most famous brewery was closing its doors. The numbers tell the full story of the catastrophe. In 1974, at the peak of Uihleins' efficiency revolution, Schlitz's brand value exceeded $1 billion. In 1982, when the company would be sold, the price was $500 million. They had lost more than 90% of their value in 8 years, from empire to ruins, from the number 2 brewer in America to a dying brand that nobody wanted. It was the fastest collapse in American business history, a case study in how arrogance, cost-cutting, and broken trust can destroy even the mightiest corporation. The beer that made Milwaukee famous had become the beer that nobody wanted. And there was no way back from that abyss. Chapter 11. The End and the Legacy. By 1981, Schlitz was finished. The only question was who would buy the corpse, and for how much. 2 Milwaukee rivals stepped forward, G. Heilemann and Pabst, both eager to acquire what remained of their former competitor. There was bitter irony in watching Milwaukee brewers fight over Schlitz's remains, picking apart the company that had once defined the city. But the U.S. Department of Justice blocked both deals, citing antitrust concerns about market concentration. In June 1982, Stroh Brewery of Detroit won the bidding war, paying $500 million for a company that had been worth over $1 billion just 8 years earlier. Stroh's executives thought they'd gotten a bargain. In reality, they'd bought a curse. The historic Milwaukee Brewery, the flagship that had produced beer for over 130 years, was closed and abandoned. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Equipment was sold for scrap. The massive brick buildings sat empty for decades, a monument to corporate failure visible from Milwaukee's highways. In 2013, the complex was finally demolished. Today it's called Schlitz Park, a mixed-use development with office buildings and apartments standing where the beer empire once dominated. The workers are gone. The brewing tradition is gone. Only the name remains, attached to real estate that has nothing to do with beer. Stroh never recovered from the purchase. They had borrowed heavily to acquire Schlitz, and the debt burden proved impossible to escape. The Schlitz brand never recovered under their ownership. Consumers still associated it with failure and betrayal. By 1999, Stroh itself collapsed, forced to sell all assets to Pabst Brewing Company. The circle was complete. The old Milwaukee rival who had wanted to buy Schlitz in '82 finally owned it 17 years later, acquiring the brand as part of Stroh's liquidation. For decades, Schlitz existed in limbo. It became a bargain brand, the kind of cheap beer found in corner stores but never in quality establishments. The drinkers were mostly older men clinging to nostalgia, remembering when Schlitz meant something. Quality was mediocre at best. Price was rock bottom. Most Americans under 40 had never heard of it, and those who had thought it was extinct. Then, in 2008, Pabst made an intriguing discovery. Deep in their archives, they found the original Schlitz formula from the 1960s, before Uhlein's cost-cutting, before the accelerated fermentation, before everything went wrong. They interviewed surviving brewmasters and taste testers, painstakingly reconstructing the beer as it had been made during Schlitz's golden age. They relaunched it as Schlitz 1960s formula, with vintage packaging and nostalgia marketing, targeting hipsters and craft beer enthusiasts who appreciated irony and history. The campaign acknowledged the mistakes. This is the real Schlitz, before they ruined it. Today, Schlitz still exists technically. You can find it in select bars at $7 a can, marketed as an ironic choice or Midwestern nostalgia. It's popular at Wisconsin Packers games. The beer itself is actually good. The original recipe restored and brewed properly, but market share remains under 1%. The Schlitz paradox is complete. The quality has been fixed, but the reputation never recovered. Once you lose trust, you can't buy it back, no matter how good your product becomes. Schlitz's legacy lives on in business schools worldwide. The Schlitz mistake is taught at Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, and MIT as the definitive case study in brand suicide through cost-cutting. The lessons are clear and brutal. Customer trust takes decades to build and seconds to destroy. Quality cannot be compromised. Customers will notice, and word of mouth spreads faster than advertising. Short-term profits mean nothing if they destroy long-term value. Marketing cannot fix a bad product no matter how much you spend. In consumer goods, product is everything. The human cost is rarely discussed in those business school lectures. Thousands of workers lost their jobs and their identities. Families who had worked at Schlitz for 3 generations saw their legacy destroyed. Milwaukee suffered an identity crisis, losing the industry that had defined it. As one former worker said, it was more than a job. It was who we were. The warning is timeless. No company is too big to fail. No brand is invincible. Schlitz ruled America for 50 years and was destroyed in less than 10. The beer that made Milwaukee famous became the beer that broke Milwaukee's heart. From the biggest brewery in America to a footnote in business textbooks, a ghost brand with a great recipe that nobody trusts. The original formula survives. The quality is restored. But the empire is gone forever, because trust, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. Schlitz learned this the hardest way possible,